Smoke rises straight into the dying light, not the smoke of a hearth, but of something burning on purpose. 4 riders. Then 11. The horizon runs red as old blood and new rust, and the Arizona ground does not care who is coming. A single footprint, pressed deep beside the creek. Clean, still. How long it had stood there no one can say. Out here, the land asks nothing of you. The sky just sits, enormous, indifferent, as if it has been waiting a long time for someone to finally stop explaining himself. There is a second chair at the kitchen table. No one has sat in it for 11 years. A rifle is loaded somewhere in the dark. The creek keeps murmuring its story, with no ending and no interest in having one. Then one morning, the woman kneeling at the water lifts her head and looks straight at him, without a flicker of fear. Arizona, 1875. The land didn't care who you were. That was the first thing Harlan noticed when he rode in. No judgment in the red dirt, no pity in the canyon walls. The sky just sat there, enormous and indifferent, like it had been waiting for someone to finally stop explaining themselves. He bought the land on a Tuesday, signed the papers without reading all of them, rode out before the ink was dry. 400 acres in the southeastern territory. 3 days on horseback from the nearest town, with a name worth remembering. A creek that came up cold and clean between 2 boulders at the base of a shallow valley. The water tasted like nothing, which is to say, it tasted like water should taste, which most water doesn't anymore, once people get involved with it. 4 walls he'd build himself. A roof he'd figure out as he went. Nobody told him it was a good idea. Nobody told him it wasn't. That was the arrangement he preferred. He was 42 years old, and he had the kind of face that made people think he'd seen more than he'd say. Deep-set eyes, the color of creek water over flat stone, somewhere between gray and green, depending on the hour. Shoulders built from years of work, not vanity. Hands that had fixed 1,000 things and broken a few he wished he hadn't. The kind of hands that look older than the man they belong to, because they've been used honestly. People called him quiet. They meant something else, because quiet is just what you call a man when you can tell he's thinking, but you can't figure out what about. Harlan had learned, slowly, and at considerable cost, that most things men called urgent weren't urgent at all. That most conversations were just noise in search of meaning. That the land asked nothing and gave what it gave and didn't pretend otherwise. He respected that, more than he'd respected most people in the last decade. Which was not a commentary on the people exactly. It was a commentary on what happens to a man when he loses the one person who made all the other people worth the effort. He built the house alone, 6 months. The walls went up in sections. Adobe brick he made himself from the red clay and straw and water from that cold creek. He learned as he went, made mistakes, fixed them without ceremony. The windows he kept small. Not because he was afraid of what was outside, because the desert heat in summer would cook a man through glass like an egg on a skillet, and Harlan had enough problems without adding that one. The roof gave him trouble. 3 weeks of trouble, specifically. But he got it right eventually. Low and heavy, the way roofs in that country needed to be. Built to hold the weight of a rare winter snow and the permanent weight of a relentless sun. Built to last longer than he needed it to. Which was another way of saying built to last. He planted 4 apple trees along the south wall. Saplings, really. Thin as optimism. His father had grown them in Virginia from a variety that did well in dry summers. Harlan had wrapped the roots in wet cloth and carried them in his saddlebag for 260 miles. He wasn't sure they'd survive the journey. He wasn't sure they'd survive the planting. He planted them anyway. Because some things you do not. Because you're sure they'll work, but because the alternative, not doing them, feels like a different kind of dying. He built a small corral. 6 head of cattle at first, then 8. A chicken coop that sat empty for 14 months because he kept forgetting to buy chickens when he rode to town. Eventually, a woman at the general store handed him 2 hens and a rooster, without him asking, and said, with the specific patience of someone who has watched a man make the same mistake 4 times, "You've been in here 4 times without chickens. This is getting embarrassing for both of us." He bought the chickens. He did not argue. There was a second chair at the kitchen table. He'd built the table himself. Rough-hewn pine, legs that weren't quite even but didn't wobble if you placed it right. He built one chair first, sat in it, looked at the empty space across from him for about 40 seconds. Then got up and built another, set it across from the first, did not explain this to anyone. There was a second hook near the front door. Iron, set into the wood at the right height for a coat or a hat. He'd hammered it in on a Sunday afternoon, and then stood back and looked at it, and felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief. Also not quite hope. Something in between all 3. Something that didn't have a name because naming it would require admitting it was there, and Harlan had gotten very good at not admitting things were there. He cooked for one, ate in silence, watched the sun go down through the small west window, that burning orange that turned the canyon walls, the color of something you couldn't name but recognized. Washed his dish, read until the oil lamp started to flutter, lay down, listened to the creek outside making its small, continuous argument in the dark, slept, woke before sunrise, did it again. For 2 years, this was enough, or close enough to enough that he stopped measuring the difference, which is its own kind of mercy, if you're willing to accept it. He had not always been a man who chose silence. There was a time, before, when Harlan was someone people gravitated toward without fully understanding why. Not because he was loud, because he was present. The kind of man who, when he looked at you, actually looked at you. Who laughed with his whole chest and meant it. Who had a gift for making any fire feel like the best fire, any night feel like the one worth remembering. He'd been the man people wanted at their table. Now he was the man with a second chair no one sat in. Elsa had loved that about him. The presence. The way he inhabited a room as though the room was glad to have him. Elsa. He didn't let himself think the name too often. Not because it hurt in an obvious way. Not anymore. It hurt in the way a healed bone aches before rain. A deep, internal reminder of something that broke and mended imperfectly. You can use it. You can walk on it. You just know, somewhere in the structure of things, that it's never quite the same. She died in the winter of 1864. Typhoid fever. Half the county went that winter. She was 31 years old with wheat-colored hair, and a laugh that started in her shoulders before it reached her face. She made terrible coffee and excellent biscuits and had a habit of humming. When she thought no one was listening, hymns, mostly, though sometimes songs that weren't hymns at all, like she'd gotten part way into church and then wandered off in her own direction and didn't feel bad about it. He had loved her in the specific, unreasonable way that a person loves someone when they believe, without evidence, without logic, that this particular person was built to be beside them. That the pairing was not coincidence but something closer to fact. He had been wrong, apparently not about her. Never about her. About the permanence of it. After she died, he didn't collapse. That would have been simpler, in a way. A clean break, a defined before and after. What he did was slower and harder to name. He just contracted. Like a house after a fire. The structure still standing, the walls still up, but something essential gone from the inside. He kept working, kept moving. Moved a lot, actually. Virginia to Ohio, Ohio to Texas, Texas to New Mexico. New Mexico somewhere else. 8 years of drift, careful and deliberate. Taking work that didn't require him to stay. Leaving before anyone expected him. Then he found the creek, or the creek found him, and he stopped. The first sign appeared in October of 1875. He almost missed it. Came around the south side of the creek bed one morning to check the water level after the last of the September rains, and saw it there in the red clay. A single footprint. clean-edged from a smooth-soled moccasin, pressed deep enough that whoever made it had been standing still. Standing still for how long, he couldn't say. Harlan crouched down, studied it. He had grown up in the mountains of Virginia and could track a white-tailed deer across limestone and still come home with something for supper. He knew what accidental footprints looked like. A person in motion, a person rushing, a person not thinking about where they're putting their feet. That's one thing. This was different. This was a person who had stood deliberately beside his creek and then left. Without taking anything, without leaving anything, just stood, just looked. He straightened up, looked around. Nothing moved but a hawk, high and unhurried, catching a thermal over the north ridge. The plateau stretched out flat and red in every direction. No movement. No sound except the creek and the hawk and the wind moving through the juniper along the canyon wall. He went back to his work. That night he loaded his rifle, set it beside the bed, lay in the dark and listened to the enormous silence of the Arizona plateau. That specific silence that isn't quiet at all, once you learn to hear it. Wind through juniper. A coyote, far east, saying something to no one in particular. The creek talking to itself in the dark, low and continuous, the way it always did, like a story with no ending and no particular interest in having one. He woke 3 times. Each time he lay still, listened, heard nothing that wasn't there before. Slept finally at what he guessed was 3 in the morning. The footprints kept appearing, always around the creek. Never approaching the house. Never in the same place twice, which meant whoever was making them was moving differently each time, reading the terrain, choosing different angles of approach. A different vantage point each visit. That wasn't carelessness. That was the opposite of carelessness. After a week, Harlan stopped taking the rifle to bed. After 2 weeks, he stopped checking the creek bank for new prints. After a month, he just accepted it the way he accepted the hawk and the coyote and the wind. The creek wasn't really his, in the most honest interpretation of the word. He'd bought the land, yes, but the water came from somewhere deeper and older than any deed, filed in a territorial office, and it would be going somewhere long after he was gone. Whoever was using it understood that so did he. There were 2 mornings he noted this without fully examining why he was noting it, when he walked to the creek before dawn and found a flat stone he was certain had not been there the day before. Not a remarkable stone, just flat and clean and placed, once near the water's edge, once slightly higher, on a natural shelf of rock, placed not fallen. He left them where they were. The morning everything changed was an ordinary one. He'd been in the cellar since before full light, working on the last of the autumn canning. Tomatoes he'd coaxed out of the east garden with more stubbornness than skill. He came out into the morning carrying a bucket of fresh milk. The light was clean and pale. The shadows still long. The air had that particular quality of early October mornings in Arizona. Cold enough to see your breath, warm enough to know the day would fix that by noon. He stepped around the corner of the barn, stopped there beside the creek. A woman, kneeling at the water's edge, filling a leather vessel with both hands. Methodical and unhurried. She was Apache. He could see that in the clothing, the single long running down her back, black as the shadow side of stone. The left forearm was wrapped in strips of cloth, improvised but tight, done by someone who knew what they were doing, or had learned fast. The way she favored her left knee when she shifted her weight, barely, but there, if you knew how to look, said the knee was giving her something to manage. She'd seen him the exact same moment he'd seen her. Both of them completely still, 70 yards of red earth and silence between them. And here is where Harlan Red expected something specific, because men in the Arizona Territory in 1875 had expectations about moments like this. Expectations built from stories, from fear, from a particular brand of ignorance that had been dressed up as experience for so long that most people couldn't tell the difference anymore. He expected alarm, flight, At minimum, the body's preparation for one of those two things. What he got was different. She looked at him. That was all, not the look of an animal cornered, not the look of a person calculating odds. Just looked. Directly. With the kind of steady, unhurried attention you give to something you are genuinely curious about. The way you look at the hawk. The way you look at the creek itself. An interesting feature of the morning that warranted observation. No fear. None. Harlan had looked into the eyes of men who'd pointed guns at him, and he knew what real absence of fear looked like, because he'd had to teach himself some version of it. And he knew it never looked like this. What he'd taught himself was controlled, managed. A decision made every second to not show the thing you felt. This was different. This was the absence of fear that comes not from bravery, but from the simple fact that the concept of fearing him, specifically, had apparently not occurred to her. Not as a suppressed thought, not as a managed reflex. Just not there. Like asking someone why they're not afraid of a particular color. The question doesn't make sense. It occurred to him. The most surprised person in this moment, by a significant margin. He looked away first. He was not sure later what made him do it. Instinct. Maybe. Or something older than instinct. The understanding that some situations require you to be smaller rather than larger. That, looking away, is sometimes the most powerful thing you can do. He turned back toward the house, went inside, stood in the kitchen, looked at the table, at the two chairs. Thought, and then stopped thinking before the thought became something with a name. Came back out 2 minutes later with a square of cornbread, wrapped in cloth and a small jar of honey he'd bought from the Mennonite family 40 miles west on his last run to town. He walked to the flat stone near the creek. The placed one, the one he'd left where he found it, and set both things on top, 16 feet from where she'd been kneeling, close enough to be an offer. Far enough to not be a demand. He walked to the barn, picked up his tools, made enough noise with them that anyone within earshot could track exactly where he was without having to look. When he came out an hour later, the stone was empty. She came back the next day, and the day after. He didn't watch. He made a point of not watching. Because some things only work if you don't push them. Like a fire you're coaxing from wet wood, or an animal that's deciding whether to trust you, or a truth you're waiting for someone to get ready to say. You keep your eyes on your own work. You keep your hands busy. You let the thing develop at its own pace or not at all. Third visit. He left dried meat alongside the food, and a clean strip of cotton cloth, the kind of thing useful for a wound that needed changing. Fourth visit. He stayed in the barn the whole time, working with the deliberate, unnecessary loudness of a man communicating his location, through sound alone. Here, right here. I'm not hiding from you. Fifth visit. He walked out of the house, and she was already there. Not at the creek, sitting on the flat stone, waiting. He stopped on the porch. She looked at him the same way. She always looked at him. Like he was a piece of the morning she was still taking in. He gave a small nod, precise. Not elaborate. She returned it the same way. Precise, unhurried. He went to the barn. When he came back out, she was gone. But she'd left something on the stone. He walked over, picked it up. A small, woven object, no bigger than his palm, red and blue and a deep yellow ochre, bound with a simple knot. He couldn't have said what it was, whether it had a function, or was purely made for the making of it, but it had been made carefully, intentionally. That much was visible in every fiber. Someone had thought about this. He held it a long moment, put it in the front pocket of his vest, carried it there for 6 weeks before he moved it. Her name was Chima. He would not know this for months. He would not know, for months, a great deal of things about her. Because that was not how this worked. What he knew in those first weeks was only what could be communicated without language, which turned out to be quite a lot if you paid attention. She was not afraid. She was precise in everything she did. The arm healed steadily. the bandaging replaced twice before it stopped needing replacement. The knee remained a private negotiation. He could see it toss her on inclines, on rocky ground, when the weight shifted unexpectedly. But she managed it without complaint and without asking for acknowledgement. She moved through pain the way some people move through weather, aware of it, accommodating it, refusing to make it the loudest thing in the room. She watched him work sometimes, from a distance at first, then closer. Not intrusively, she had a particular gift for being present, without imposing presence. He'd look up, and she'd be 20 feet away, watching him repair a fence or check the water channel, with the patient attention of someone who is learning something and is in no hurry to stop learning it. He watched her sometimes, from an equal distance. And in this way, careful, non-verbal, calibrated to a specific fear that neither of them would have admitted was fear, something began, not a friendship, exactly, not yet a recognition. Two people who had both learned the hard way to be extremely careful about what they allowed to matter. Standing on opposite sides of a flat stone, leaving things for each other, with the scrupulous casualness of people who are pretending this isn't meaningful. It was meaningful. They both knew it. Neither said so. He started trying to learn words. This was not graceful. He pointed at the creek. She said the word in Chiricahua, clean and percussive. Nothing like any sound he'd been making with his mouth for 42 years. He repeated it. She corrected him. He tried again. She corrected him again, with the specific patience of someone who has decided that patience is simply the correct tool for this job and there's no point resenting the tool. He pointed at the hawk. She told him the word. He butchered it magnificently. He pointed at the apple trees, which were putting out new growth now and looking, against all reasonable expectation, like they might survive. He attempted something in Chiricahua based on the fragments he'd been collecting. Based on her expression, he had apparently said something involving a horse, a large rock, or possibly a type of weather event he couldn't identify. Her face did something it hadn't done before. It broke, not badly, not wide open, but the corner of her mouth moved, and then the other corner. And then she was laughing, abruptly and completely. The way a person laughs when they've been holding it back for a while, and the holding finally becomes more effort than the release. It wasn't a polite laugh. It was a real one. The kind that involves the shoulders and the lungs. The kind that doesn't care if anyone's watching. Harlan stood there, holding his incorrect sentence in the air like a bird that had died mid-flight. He felt something move inside his chest. Not a dramatic shift. Not the ground giving way, more like a stone that had been sitting perfectly still in a particular place for 11 years had been displaced. Just slightly, just an inch. It was still there. The weight was still there. But it had moved. He taught her English words in return. She learned faster than seemed fair, absorbing each one with the focused attention of someone mapping new terrain. Not rushing, but thorough. Nothing was approximate with her. She wanted the precise word, the exact meaning, the way it was actually used in practice, rather than the way it was theoretically defined. She caught the difference between those two things faster than most people born into the language. He found himself choosing his words more carefully, which was new, or rather, it was old. It was the way he'd been before. Before careful stopped seeming worth the effort. Then the men from Territorial Mining came. Two of them rode up on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, when Harlan was repairing the north fence post, which had been working loose in the soil since the September rains softened everything around it. They were dressed for the city in riding, yanked like men who'd learned horses from books. Their saddles were too clean, their expressions too managed. The kind of men who have decided in advance what they want and have spent the ride over, rehearsing how to ask for it. "Afternoon," said the taller one. He had the voice of a man accustomed to conference rooms that didn't exist yet in this part of the world. "You'd be the Red Claim? I'd be Harlan Red," Harlan said. The claim doesn't ride, a small, professional smile that had been calibrated for exactly this kind of response. We represent Territorio Mining Company, operating out of Tucson. We're developing mineral extraction operations approximately 8 miles north of your position. We're looking to secure water access rights for those operations, specifically the spring on your south parcel. No. The smile recalibrated. We're prepared to offer fair market compensation. No, Mr. Red. The water use would be, I heard you. Harlan set down his fence post tool, straightened up, looked at both of them with the particular tranquility that people occasionally mistook for vacancy, but was in fact just the absence of performance. The spring isn't for sale. The rights aren't for negotiation. The answer is no. It'll stay no, and I'd save us both some afternoon if you rode back and told whoever sent you that. The taller man looked at him. A beat too long. Be a shame, he said finally, with the specific gentleness of a man placing something sharp on a table. If water operations up north affected the natural flow down to a claim this size. Harlan held the look, held it. Ride safe, he said. They rode. He watched them until they were gone. Two small figures shrinking into the red distance, and then entered the fence post and finished his work. Drove the post deeper, packed the soil tighter around it. Checked the tension on the wire. He did not mention this to anyone. There was no one to mention it to. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the whole thing had been watched. From a vantage point on the eastern ridge, a shelf of sandstone set back in the rock at an angle that gave a clear sight line to the entire front approach of the property without being visible from below. Chima had been sitting when the two riders came up the north trail. She had watched the whole conversation from 150 yards. She couldn't hear the words. But she didn't need words. She could read it in the bodies, in the way the two men leaned in, with the particular weight of people making offers that expect to be accepted. In the way Harlan set down his tool, not in anger, not defensively, but in the specific stillness of a man who has stopped doing other things because this requires his full attention, and in the way they left. Not fast, not rattled, but they left. She watched Harlan go back to his fence post, back to the work as though it was simply the next thing, which to him, apparently, it was. She climbed down from the ridge, walked back across the high plateau, into the lower country, to where the camp was set 3 miles east, in a canyon the maps didn't name because the maps didn't know about it. Tohono was there, her brother. He looked up when she came in and read her face the way he'd been reading her face for 35 years. The way other men read weather. The man at the waterland, she said. Tohono waited. 2 men came. They wanted the spring. He waited still. He said no without thinking about it. She paused. He didn't ask what he'd get. He didn't count the cost. He didn't. She stopped. Switched back from the English she'd been reaching for. He just said no. Like the water was not a thing to be traded. Tohono was quiet for a moment. What else? He went back to his fence. Tohono looked at the fire. 3 weeks, he said. She nodded once. 3 weeks was how long they had been discussing what to do about the territory situation. The slow encroachment of the mining company's survey markers. The increasing pressure from the territorial government. The maps being redrawn by people who had never stood on the land they were drawing. 3 weeks of careful discussion. And what they needed, what they had been trying to determine, was whether there was anyone on the edge of their territory who was worth knowing. The man at the waterland had, apparently, just answered that question, without knowing he'd been asked. He had been tested. That's the thing he would understand only later, when Tohono told him directly. Because Tohono was not a man who left important things to implication. The footprints, the visits. Chima's careful, unhurried observation over those weeks of exchange. The cornbread, the cloth, the small woven object, the words traded one by one across a flat stone. All of it had been deliberate, not manipulative, not a trap. Assessment. Her people needed to know who was on the boundary of their territory. Not what the land registry said. Not what the territorial government had filed. Who the man was. What he did when no one was watching. Whether he was the kind of person who understood, however differently from them, however imperfectly, that water is not a commodity. Kaima had been the one sent to find out. Because she was good at it. Because she had the patience and the eye and the ability to read a person through their choices rather than their declarations. Most people, given enough time, tell you exactly who they are through what they do when they think no one's paying attention. She had been there as a matter of survival. What happened after? The laughter over the wrong word. The stone that became a place rather than just a rock. The way Harlan always made enough noise to tell her exactly where he was, without her having to wonder. That part was not the mission. That part had grown in the way things grow in that country, slowly. Against the odds. Rooted in rock. You don't plan for that kind of thing. You just discover one morning that it's there. November gave way to December. December to January. The rains came and softened the red clay. Harlan repaired 2 fence sections that went down in the runoff. He found one morning that 3 of the fence posts on the northwest corner had been reset. Not by him, not in the night. With a precision that suggested someone who understood soil load and drainage and the way frost moves through packed earth in winter. He looked at the work for a long time, didn't touch it. Just nodded at it, the way you nod at something good. The apple trees, improbably, against every reasonable expectation, showed the first signs of thriving. Not just surviving, thriving. New growth on the top branches, the kind of upward reach that says the fruits have found something to hold on to. He stood in front of them one cold January morning, breath visible, red earth dark from the last rain, 4 trees. Carried from Virginia, wrapped in wet cloth. He hadn't been sure they'd live. He was beginning to think they might. The second time the territorial mining men came, there were 4 of them, February. Mid-morning. He saw them coming from a quarter mile, 4 riders on the North Trail, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who had decided, between the last visit and this one, that the situation had changed. It had not changed, but they didn't know that yet. The man in front was different this time, older than the previous 2. Burton Graff. Though Harlan didn't know his name yet, he had the look of a man who had learned long ago that patience was more effective than force, and had been applying this lesson with considerable success for decades. Broad-shouldered, good coat. The kind of ease that belongs to men who have never had to wonder whether the room was on their side, Mr. Red. He rode up to the fence line and stopped his horse with one hand, the gesture of a man accustomed to controlling large things without apparent effort. My name is Burton Graff. I believe some of my associates spoke with you in November. They did. I thought it might be worth a conversation between the 2 of us directly. Man to man. The phrase had always struck Harlan as the verbal equivalent of a handshake that's slightly too firm. A performance of a quality rather than the quality itself. We're having one, Harlan said. Graff smiled. It was a good smile, practiced in the way a good tool is practiced, shaped by use until it fit the hand exactly. Territorial mining is conducting mineral survey operations across 400 square miles of the southeastern territory, he said. We have territorial government authorization, filed appropriately with the land office in Tucson. What we're looking for from individual landowners is a cooperative arrangement. Water access, in exchange for fair compensation, and, more than that, a stake in the development of this region. This territory is changing, Mr. Red. It'll be a state inside 20 years. The men who got in early on that change. No, the smile held. You haven't heard the offer. Don't need to. That's a considerable piece of stubbornness for a man on 400 acres. Harlan looked at him. Just look, the spring feeds my cattle and my trees and the land I farm, he said. It's not for commercial extraction. It won't be. Anything else you're carrying this afternoon? You can carry it back, eh? Beat, then Graff said something interesting. Not a threat. A statement of fact, delivered in the precise tone, used to make facts sound like threats, without technically being one. Water rights in the territorial system are subject to review when upstream operations change the natural flow, he said. Something worth being aware of, he nodded once, professionally, turned his horse. The four of them rode back up the North Trail. Harlan watched them go. There was something about Graff that sat differently than the first two men. Not worse, exactly. More concerning. The first two had been emissaries. People doing a job they hadn't fully invested in. Graff was a man who believed in what he was building. That was its own particular kind of dangerous. You can reason with a man who doubts. You can't always reason with a man who's certain. He was standing at the kitchen table that evening, making supper, when he became aware of how quiet the house was. Not the outside silence, the inside kind, the kind that has nothing to do with sound. He looked at the two chairs, he thought, without meaning to, without wanting to, about the last supper Elsa had made in their kitchen in Virginia. Pork and sweet potato, and a bread she'd baked that morning that filled the whole house. She'd been humming. That off-hymn wandering hum of hers, going somewhere between church and somewhere else entirely. He had not appreciated it enough. That's the thing you realize afterward, with the kind of clarity that is completely useless, because it has nowhere to go. You didn't appreciate it enough in the moment. And then the moment was over, and you'd give most of what you had to go back and pay attention, the way you should have. He sat down in his chair. The other chair was empty. The second hook by the door held nothing. Outside, the creek kept talking in the dark. He sat there for a while, not sad exactly, not undone, just present in it, which is the best and worst you can do with grief at 11 o'clock on a February night, in a 400-acre silence in the Arizona Territory. Eventually, he washed his dish, banked the fire, lay down, thought briefly, before he could stop it, about a laugh that had started in the shoulders. Not Elsa's this time, a different one. He was asleep before he had to decide what to make of that. March came in cold and softened by the third week. The apple trees put out their first thin blooms, white and fragile and completely improbable against the red rock backdrop. Like someone had made an argument in the wrong language that turned out to be right anyway. He stood looking at them. One morning, the light just getting warm enough to matter, when he heard her footstep on the rock shelf to his left. Not sneaking, just arriving, but he'd gotten better at hearing when she was near. Not because she made more noise, but because he'd started listening differently. For the particular rhythm of weight, shifting across sandstone. For the adjustment a person makes when managing a knee on uneven ground, he didn't turn right away. She came and stood beside him. They looked at the trees together for a while. They shouldn't be here, he said eventually. Wrong altitude, wrong soil, probably. She looked at him sidelong. But they are here, she said. Her English was considerably better than it had been 6 months ago. Not perfect, but precise. She said what she meant, and meant what she said, and didn't bother with the extra words people use to pad out the space between meaning and communication. They are, Harlan allowed. She looked back at the trees. My grandmother had a word, she said, for things that grow where they should not be able to. Things that find root in places that look like they have nothing to offer. He waited. I won't translate it exactly, but it means something like, stubborn enough to matter. He was quiet for a moment. That's a good word. Yes, she said. It is. They stood there. The morning moved around them, light changing its angle. A hawk finding a thermal out over the canyon, the apple blossoms doing their improbable thing. And something else was doing its improbable thing too, right there, in the same morning. Quiet and stubborn and rooted in rock. Neither of them named it, not yet, but it was there, definitely there. Spring came to the Arizona plateau the way it always did, not gently, Just one morning, the light was different, sharper, the kind of light that makes you squint even before you're fully awake. The red clay had dried from the February rains and gone back to that deep burnt color, the color of something that has been through heat and come out the other side and found it was fine with that. Harlan was splitting wood behind the house when he saw them. Not two this time, not 411. Coming across the high plateau from the northeast in a diagonal line, single file, horseback, no hurry and no hesitation. The way people move when they've made a decision, and they're simply in the process of carrying it out. He set the axe down, stood up straight, watched. The man at the front was not someone he'd seen before. Broad, probably Harlan's age, maybe younger but older in the way the desert makes things older. Not worn down, but concentrated, like sunlight through glass. A diagonal scar began at the left temple and disappeared behind the ear. His eyes, even at this distance, had the particular scanning quality of a person who has spent years making sure no part of a landscape goes unregistered. Chima was there, third in the line. She caught his eye briefly, did not smile, did not signal anything except the fact that she had seen him, which was its own kind of signal. They stopped at the fence line, 30 feet from the porch. Nobody spoke. Harlan looked at the line of 11 people looking back at him. He thought. Quickly, without drama about the rifle inside the door. Then he thought about the fact that if these people had wanted to be a problem, they would have had plenty of opportunities in the past 6 months and had not taken any of them. He turned and went inside, came back out with the coffee pot and 6 cups. Six cups, because that was all he had. He carried them to the space between the porch and the fence line, crouched down, set the cups in the dirt, poured, straightened up, looked at the man, the coffee. The man looked at the Harlan. Dismounted. The other 10 stayed on their horses. The man walked forward and sat down on the ground, cross-legged, easy, like the ground was a perfectly reasonable chair, which it is when you've spent your life on it. Harlan sat down across from him, poured a second cup, slid it forward. The man picked it up. They drank. The silence lasted. Harlan counted without meaning to. Approximately 20 minutes. In those 20 minutes, the morning went on doing what mornings do. A cloud shadow crossed the plateau from west to east. 2 of the horses shifted their weight. The creek made its small continuous argument from the far side of the property. Nobody spoke. And here is the thing about silence between 2 people who are both comfortable with it. It isn't empty. It's full of things that don't require words. Assessment. Calibration. The slow, honest work of deciding what kind of person you're dealing with. Not from what they say, but from how they sit, where they put their hands, whether their eyes move around the landscape from anxiety or from habit. Harlan kept his hands on his knees. His eyes were steady. The man with the scar drank his coffee at the pace of a man who is in no rush to finish it. Eventually, the man said something in Chiricahua, low, deliberate. Harlan didn't understand most of it, but he understood 2 words, water, and the word Chima had used for him once. The one she'd said meant something like young warrior, but had delivered with an expression suggesting it was at least half ironic. He used it without irony, or with a different kind. Harlan nodded once. The man nodded once. That was the beginning. His name was Tohono, Chima's older brother. Harlan would learn this later, with context. The way you learn most things about people who don't offer information, casually. In pieces, over time, each piece fitting against the others until a shape emerged that you could finally name. What he learned first was what Tohono valued. Competence, directness, the ability to work without needing to be managed. Harlan had all 3. So did Tohono, which meant they got along fine without liking each other yet, and both of them understood that was a reasonable place to start. The arrangement that developed was not discussed. It simply happened. The way things happen when 2 groups of people are occupying the same territory, and neither is going to leave, and neither is an idiot. 3 weeks after the coffee on the ground, Harlan came out at dawn to find 2 men from Tohono's group already at the northwest fence line, the section that had been slowly failing since winter. They had tools he didn't recognize and methods he hadn't seen. They worked with an efficiency that was different from his efficiency, but arrived at the same place. The fence was better than it had been. He brought them water. They accepted it. He worked alongside them for the rest of the morning. Nobody explained anything. Nobody needed to. Kaima started coming earlier. Not to the creek. To the work. She would appear at the east side of the property around mid-morning. Watch what he was doing for a few minutes. Then start doing something adjacent. She knew plants in a way that made his gardening look like guessing, which, to be fair, it mostly was. She looked at the small east garden one afternoon. The tomatoes, the beans he'd tried twice with limited success, the herbs he'd bought dried from town because he couldn't figure out how to grow them fresh. And she had an expression that was not quite judgment and not quite pity. Something in between. "You're asking the wrong things of this soil," she said. "I'm asking it to grow food. You're asking it to grow food the way your father's soil grew food." He opened his mouth, closed it, because she was right. He'd been farming by memory, Virginia memory. This was not Virginia. He'd been stubbornly planting the same things in the same configurations and being mildly baffled by the results. She crouched down, picked up a handful of dirt, let it fall through her fingers. "This soil wants different things," she said. "Deeper roots. Plants that know how to be thirsty. What does it want to grow?" She looked up at him. That look. The direct one. The one that saw him and was not particularly concerned about whether that made him comfortable. "I'll show you," she said. And she did. Over the following weeks, she taught him things no book he'd ever owned contained, which plants held moisture at their roots and could be planted as living mulch around the more demanding crops. How to read the soil's color for what it was missing. How to quarter-hicks down through the clay layer rather than letting it run off the surface. He taught the 2 younger men from Tohono's group how to reinforce beam joints for winter loads. They were fast learners. He taught, they learned. Then they showed him a joining technique that used the natural tension of the wood grain rather than fighting it, something he'd never seen, but immediately understood was better than what he'd been doing. He learned. Nobody made it a larger thing than it was, which is exactly how the largest things become possible. Itza came on a Thursday. He didn't know her name yet. He just knew, from the way everyone else's posture shifted almost imperceptibly when she arrived, the way space reorganized itself around her, without anyone appearing to do anything, that this was someone different. She was perhaps 68, perhaps older, the kind of face that has arrived at a specific relationship with time. Not fighting it, not defeated by it, but in conversation with it. Deep lines at the corners of her eyes. Hair gone fully silver. Worn loose and long. She moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided that every movement should be worth making. She arrived at the property, mid-morning with Chima, and stood for a moment just looking at the house. Not at Harlan, at the house, like she was reading it. Like a house is a document, which Harlan would think about later. It is. A house tells you what a person anticipated, what they prepared for, what they hoped for, in the specific silent language of extra chairs and second hooks, and gardens planted with more space than one person requires. She came inside when he offered, looked at the kitchen, the table, the 2 chairs. Her eyes moved to the second hook by the door, stayed there briefly. Moved on. She said something to Chima. Chima's expression shifted. Something complicated that was not quite amusement and not quite sadness. She says, Chima said carefully, that your house was built for 2 people. Harlan was quiet. She says you have never actually lived alone here. You have only been waiting. The kitchen was very still. Outside, the creek. She's right, Harlan said. His voice came out quieter than he'd meant it to, because he had not said this before. Had not said it to anyone, anywhere, in any form. Had arranged his entire existence around the careful project of not saying it. Not to neighbors who'd offered company he'd declined. Not to the men at the general store, who'd occasionally pushed a second drink across the bar with the gentleness of men who understand loneliness. Without naming it, he'd said it to no one. And now he'd said it to this woman he'd known for 3 minutes, in a kitchen she'd entered for the first time, in a language she didn't speak. He said it and felt not relief, exactly. Something more complicated than relief. Like a window being opened in a room that has been closed a long time. Itza looked at him directly. Said something else, Chima translated. This time there was that thing at the corner of her mouth. That almost lightness she kept mostly hidden. She says that weight that doesn't belong to you can be left in the earth. The earth was made to hold things. Harlan looked at Itza. Itza held his look. The look of someone who had used up her patience for pretense a long time ago, and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He nodded. She nodded. Something passed between them that had no name in English, or Chiricahua either. Just recognition. The days lengthened. The apple trees bloomed and set fruit, small and hard in June, softening and reddening through July and into August. More than he could use alone. He left baskets of them at the flat stone by the creek. The baskets came back empty. Sometimes with things in them, dried herbs, a small clay pot he put on the windowsill, and didn't fully understand but left there, which turned out to be the correct response. He'd started sleeping better. This was not nothing. For 11 years, since the winter of 1864, Harlan Red had been a bad sleeper, a persistent, low-level inability to fully commit to unconsciousness. He'd wake at 2 or 3 in the morning, lie in the dark, listen to the night, go back under eventually. He stopped waking up, somewhere between April and August. He didn't notice until the not waking had been happening for several weeks. And then he noticed it the way you notice the absence of a sound you'd grown so accustomed to that you'd stopped hearing it. By the strangeness of the quiet, he didn't examine why. Some things you just let be. He was repairing the east wall of the barn in late July when Chima came and sat on the fence rail and watched him for a while. "Tohono wants to talk to you," she said. "All right. About the situation." He paused his work, looked at her. She had been getting quieter, in a way that was different from her usual quiet. Her usual quiet was active, present. This new quiet had a held quality, like something waiting for the right time. "What situation?" "The company," she said. "The men with the maps." He set down his tool. She told him in the way she did most things. Carefully, in pieces. Each piece given enough space to settle before the next one. What he understood by the end of the week. Territorial Mining was not just interested in the spring on his south parcel. The survey maps Graff had carried on his February visit had redrawn the eastern boundary of the company's proposed operations. A redrawing that, if recognized by the territorial government's land office, would extend mining rights across the high plateau north of Harlan's property line. The high plateau that the Chiricahua had used for generations. Where, on the northwest edge of the rock formation that Harlan had always called the Red Shelf, there was a burial ground, not marked on any map, not recorded in any territorial document, not legally protected by anything that existed in 1875 in the Arizona Territory, but real, more real, in the way the deepest things are real, than any document in any office in Tucson. Harlan's property, his 400 acres, his spring, his adobe house and his apple trees, sat directly between Graff's proposed operations and that plateau. He hadn't known this when he bought the land. He hadn't known it when he refused to sell the water rights. He'd been a barrier without knowing what he was blocking, which landed in him with a weight he needed a moment to absorb. That the choice he'd made, alone, not for any grand reason, his simple stubbornness, his refusal to let a spring be turned into a commercial resource, that choice had been protecting something, without his knowledge, without his intention. and somehow that made it mean more, not less. Tohono came to the property on a Sunday evening in August. Just Tohono. No one else. He dismounted at the fence line. Harlan opened the gate. They walked to the porch and sat, side by side facing south, looking at the canyon and the last horizontal light of the evening. Harlan made coffee. They drank, Tohono said. His English had been improving steadily. What she told you, about the plateau. Yes, and the map, Tohono was quiet a moment. They will come back, he said. The man with the good coat. He will come back with more paper. Better paper, probably. Paper made by people who never stood on this land. That's how it works, Harlan said. In the system they're using. Yes, Tohono looked at the canyon. We have been pushed before, he said. Each time they said it would be the last time. Each time there was more paper. Harlan didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would make that less true. What do you need? Harlan asked instead. Tohono turned and looked at him, a long look. The kind that is actually several questions in the shape of one. You would ask that, Tohono said. Not, what will you do? Not, this is your problem. You ask what we need. It seemed like the right question. Tohono was quiet again. We need the land to have a name that the paper makers know. Harlan understood. You need it to belong to someone who exists in their system. You have a deed. You have a filing in Tucson. You are a man with a name they will write down. Harlan looked at the canyon. The light was going now. That last burning minute before the sun dropped behind the western ridge, when everything went briefly, impossibly red. The rock walls. The red earth. His hands on the coffee cup. Everything the same color as old blood and new rust, and something that was neither. We should talk about what that would mean, Harlan said. Yes, said Tohono. Not tonight. No, Tohono agreed. Not tonight. They sat until dark. Watched the stars come out. First one, then a dozen, then the full impossible extravagance of the Arizona night sky. Tohono left without ceremony. Harlan sat alone on the porch for another hour, thinking. Not about graph. Not about deeds and territorial law. About the choice in front of him. About what it would mean to say yes. And whether, after 11 years of careful contraction, of choosing distance as a form of safety, he had any idea how to choose differently. The conversation he hadn't expected happened on a Thursday afternoon. He was at the creek, clearing debris from the channel after a brief, hard rain, when Chima appeared on the rock shelf above, sitting with her knees drawn up, watching the plateau. Not watching him, just there. Thinking he finished the clearing. Sat on the flat stone. The stone that had been a neutral point once. That had gradually become something he didn't have a word for. Tohono told you what we're asking, she said. Without preamble. Yes. What did you think? I thought I needed to understand it better before I said anything. She came down from the shelf. Sat on the stone, not quite beside him. Her own distance, her own angle. Facing the water. It isn't simple, she said. I know, it would change your life here. Yes, people in town would have opinions. People in town have opinions about everything, he said. I've been ignoring them since I came here. I'm in practice. The corner of her mouth. That almost thing. Gone before it fully arrived. Harlan. She said his name with the particular directness she brought to everything. No softening, no qualification. Just the name, as a way of making sure he was actually present for what came next. There's something you should know, she said. Before you decide. He waited. I came to your creek on purpose. He looked at her. She was still looking at the water. Tohono needed to know about the man on the waterland. I was sent. To watch. To learn what kind of man you were before we made any decisions about what to do. A pause. So the visits? He said, at first. Yes. The footprints, yes. He sat with this. It should have felt like something to be angry about. He registered the shape of where the anger could go. The idea of having been assessed without his knowledge. The idea that the connection he thought had been spontaneous had in fact had a beginning that was strategic, but he thought about what he'd done at the fence. The water. The flat no. He thought about what Chima had seen from the ridge, and he thought what she'd come looking for was whether he was a man worth knowing. And what she'd found, what she'd decided to bring back to her brother, was yes, he was. Which meant the assessment had not concluded with suspicion. It had concluded with something more like trust, and trust decided on with careful deliberation, rather than impulse, was worth more. Not less. Did you find what you came for? He asked. She turned to look at him. I found more than I came for, she said, which was the most she had ever said about what this was. And also exactly enough. The news about Graff came from the general store. Harlan rode into town in late August for supplies. Osworth, who had been running the store for 15 years and knew everything that passed through the territory, gave him his order and then said, without looking up from the ledger, "There's been survey crews out on the plateau north of your claim, I know. Territorio's been filing amendments to their extraction rights, with the land office." Harlan went still. What are they claiming? That the original survey was error-marked. That the boundary line should sit 2 miles south of where you filed. 2 miles south. That would put Graff's operation boundary directly through Harlan's north pasture, and leave the plateau entirely exposed. He paid for his supplies. Rode back, slowly. Thinking he told Chima that evening, "He's not using men," she said. "He's using the system." Yes, which is harder to fight with a rifle. Considerably, they talked through it. He could go to Tucson, contest the amendment, produce his original deed and original survey. Whether it would work. The Territorial Land Office was not always impartial when there was money on one side. "But you would go," she said. Yes. She looked at him steadily. "You haven't been to a town larger than Osworth's store since you came here." He didn't answer immediately. Because she was right. The slow retreat from people and places and everything that reminded him of a life that had included Elsa and then hadn't. The deliberate narrowing of his world to something he could manage without risk. Harlan. Yes. "I need to ask you something." Something in her voice was different. "A careful wait, will you stay?" she said. "When it gets hard. When he comes back with more paper. Or the drought comes. Or the winter is longer than expected. Or when the quiet starts to look easier than all of this." He sat very still. It was the question he hadn't asked himself. Not directly. Not honestly. Because asking it honestly meant acknowledging that staying was not simply what had happened, but was something he was choosing, or not choosing, every day. That the pattern of the past years, work, silence, the flat stone, the second chair, the apple trees he planted without being sure they'd survive. All of it had been a long prologue to this exact moment. "What did you tell Itza?" he asked. "When she asked you if I would stay." Chima looked at him. "I told her I didn't know," she said, "and that she should ask you." He looked at the creek. At the 4 apple trees, heavy with fruit in the late August light. At the house with its 2 chairs and its second hook. And its garden, that was now producing more than he could eat alone. He thought about Elsa. He thought about the weight in his chest. He thought about a stone. "Displaced an inch. I stay," he said. Chima was very still. "Harlan, I stay," he said again, more quietly, but with a firmness that was not stubbornness, was not the reflexive hardness he'd been carrying, was a decision. Clean and deliberate and landed. Then, she said, "There is something else you need to know." And she told him, not just about the plateau and the burial ground and the pressure to relocate, about her husband, Keeley, killed 3 years ago. Not in a fight that made sense. In the kind of violence that doesn't. The kind that comes from one group of people deciding that another group existence is an inconvenience to their plans. A confrontation with survey workers from a mining company operating 100 miles north. Not territorial mining specifically, but the same system, the same logic, the same maps drawn by people who'd never met the men they were erasing. She said it plainly, without performance. The way she said everything, as information not as tragedy, even though it was both. Harlan listened. He did not fill the silence after she finished. He understood that some things need space to settle before any response is appropriate. After a while, he said, "I'm sorry." "Yes," she said. "I didn't know." "No." A pause. "I didn't tell you." "Why now?" She looked at the creek for a long moment. "Because you just told me you're staying," she said. "And people who stay should know where they're standing." He thought about that. "Fair," he said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Graff came back in September. This time he came alone. No lawyers, no riders. Just Graff on his horse, in his good coat. In the mid-morning light, he rode up to the gate and stopped and waited. Harlan came out of the house. They looked at each other across the fence. "I imagine you've heard about the boundary amendment," Graff said. "I have. I want you to understand, Red, that this isn't personal. The original survey had documented errors. Correcting them is a legal and administrative. The survey didn't have errors," Harlan said. "The new map has errors. Specifically, it has a 2-mile error in the direction that benefits your company." A pause. Graff tilted his head slightly. The professional smile was absent today. What was in its place was something more honest, which Harlan actually found he preferred. A man showing you his actual face, even if his actual face is adversarial, is easier to deal with than a man hiding it. "You can contest it in Tucson," Graff said. "I know. That process can be lengthy, expensive. The outcome is not guaranteed. I know that too. It would save us both considerable time and difficulty if you were willing to revisit the water rights arrangement." On better terms than originally offered, Harlan looked at him. "Mr. Graff, yes, there are no terms. The water doesn't move. The boundary doesn't move. I'm going to Tucson to contest the amendment, and I'm going to do it with the original survey, which was correctly filed, and with whatever else I need to make the case." Graff sat with this. "You're one man," he said. Not a threat, a statement of what he believed to be a relevant fact. "Not quite," Harlan said. From the ridge to the east, Harlan didn't look, but he heard the slight shifting of weight on rock. He knew Tohono was there. Had been there since Graff rode up. Had come without being asked, because there are people who show up when the moment calls for it and don't require an invitation. Graff looked toward the Ron. Graff looked toward the ridge. His eyes moved across the landscape with the quick, assessing quality of a man running a calculation. He completed the calculation. "I see," he said. He turned his horse. Rode back up the North Trail at the pace of a man who has decided to pursue this particular fight in a different arena. Harlan watched him go. Then he looked at the ridge. Tohono was up there. He couldn't quite see him, but he knew exactly where he was. He raised one hand, brief. Acknowledgement from the ridge. Something moved. A slight shift. Maybe a hand. Maybe just the posture of a man who had seen what he came to see and was satisfied with it. That night, Harlan sat at the kitchen table. Both chairs pulled up, because Chima was across from him for the first time. Not outside, not at the creek, not on the porch. Inside, at the table, they ate. Nothing elaborate. The kind of supper a man with a reasonably stocked kitchen puts together when he wants to make sure another person gets fed. And for a while neither of them spoke. Not awkward. Not strained, just. Two people having a meal together, which is the oldest and most ordinary form of saying you are welcome here, without making it into a speech. "I'll go to Tucson next week," Harlan said. She nodded. "I'll be back inside of 10 days, maybe 12. "All right, while I'm gone." "We'll be here," she said. He looked at her. That was not a small thing. "We'll be here. Not we'll check on the property. We'll be here, meaning this place will not be empty when you come back. This place will be inhabited in your absence by people who have decided it is worth inhabiting." He looked at the second chair, occupied. At the second hook by the door, holding a woven bag, Chima had hung there without asking permission. Because she hadn't thought to ask, which was its own kind of answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. "Thank you," he said. She raised her eyes to his. "For what?" He thought about it. "For standing on the ridge," he said. "The first time." She was quiet a moment. "You weren't supposed to know about that, I know. Tohono would say I was careless. Tohono, Harlan said, would be wrong." Her face, that shift, that almost thing at the corner of her mouth, that had been happening more frequently and staying longer. This time it didn't disappear. This time it stayed. And in the warm light of the oil lamp, in the kitchen of a house built for two people who'd taken 11 years to find each other, he felt it in his chest. Not the weight exactly. The way a room feels different after someone opens a window. Same walls, same everything, but the air had moved. And breathing was easier than it had been a moment before. He left on a Monday, before sunrise, the kind of departure that happens quietly because the person leaving hasn't fully decided how to feel about it yet, and noise would force the issue. Harlan saddled his horse in the dark, checked the saddlebag twice. The original deed, the original survey. A letter from a territorial land attorney in Tucson that Osworth had helped him locate. A man named Prentice, who had a reputation for being difficult and thorough in equal measure, which was exactly what the situation required. He stood in the yard a moment before mounting, looked at the house, the small west window with its lamp still burning low, left it burning deliberately, for reasons he didn't examine too closely. The 4 apple trees, dark shapes in the pre-dawn, heavy with the last of the season's fruit. The creek talking to itself in the dark, continuous, patient, not going anywhere. He mounted, rode north, didn't look back, which was something he'd gotten good at. Not looking back. 11 years of practice. The problem, and he was just now beginning to understand this, was that not looking back and actually moving forward are two completely different things. He had confused them. For a very long time, he'd been very good at not looking back. He had not been moving forward. Until now, 3 days to Tucson. He knew the route, knew the water stops. What he'd forgotten, what years of careful distance had allowed him to forget, was what it felt like to ride back into a place with people in it. Tucson in September of 1875 was not a large city by any measure that mattered east of the Mississippi. But after the plateau, after the silence and the red earth and the 400-acre solitude, after weeks of the specific, deliberate proximity of people who communicated in gestures and coffee cups and things left on flat stones, after all of that, Tucson felt like being shouted at by an entire building. The noise. The dust the horses kicked up on the main street. The hammer of new construction going up on the south end. Men talking at volumes apparently designed to be heard across entire territories. A woman arguing with a merchant through a window. 2 dogs disputing something in an alley with the kind of total commitment that made everything else seem less urgent by comparison. Harlan sat on his horse in the middle of it, breathed, reminded himself he had chosen this, rode to the land attorney's office. Prentice was a small man with a large desk and the organized ferocity of someone who has spent decades being underestimated, and decided to turn that into a professional advantage. He looked at Harlan's original deed for 45 seconds, then at the original survey. Then he picked up the amended survey that Graff's company had filed, looked at it, set it down, looked at Harlan. "Well," he said, "they moved the line, yes, 2 miles south, yes, and they filed this as a correction to an original survey error, yes." Prentice looked at the ceiling for a moment, the expression of a man doing arithmetic that is both simple and infuriating. "This amendment was filed 7 weeks ago," he said. "I know, which means they had 7 weeks to start work before anyone withstanding to contest it showed up in my office. I'm here now. You are." Prentice tapped the original survey. "This is clean. The original filing is correct. The boundary they've redrawn has no legitimate basis in the original survey language." He paused. However, there it was. However, the word that lives between winning and losing and makes itself comfortable there, territorial. Mining has filed this amendment with the signature of Deputy Territorial Surveyor James Callum, Prentice said. "Callum has been signing Territorio's paperwork for the past 2 years. He's not exactly. A careful pause. Impartial. Can you contest it? I can contest it. The question is whether the land office will schedule the hearing before Territorio begins work on the northern section. How long does scheduling take? Normally, 6 to 8 weeks. Harlan went still. And if they start work before the hearing, then we're contesting an active operation rather than a proposed one, which is a different and considerably more complicated legal position. The room was very quiet. Outside, Tucson kept shouting at itself. "What do I need to do?" Harlan said. Prentice looked at him with the evaluating expression of a man who has met many clients and learned to read them fast. "Be in Tucson for the next 10 days. Be available." "Sign what I need you to sign," he hesitated. "Do you have any documentation of continued use of the disputed territory? Letters? Records? Anything that establishes the land as actively occupied and maintained?" Harlan thought about the fence work, the creek clearing, the north pasture, thought about the people who had helped him with all of it, who had been on that land consistently, continuously, for longer than any deed had existed. "I have something better than records," he said. "What?" "Witnesses." He sent a letter back with a writer he hired at the post office, addressed to the property, meaning to whoever arrived first at the flat stone by the creek and read the note folded beneath its edge. He'd never sent a letter to his own land before. It felt strange and right in equal measure. The letter said 3 things: that the hearing would happen, that he needed time, and that he was coming back. That last part wasn't strictly legally necessary. He put it in anyway. On the 4th day in Tucson, Tohono arrived. Harlan was at Prentice's office when the attorney's assistant knocked on the door and said, in the specific tone of someone trying to maintain professional composure, while internally recalibrating all prior assumptions about that photon. There are several, that is to say, there are men outside who say they are here for Mr. Red. Harlan went to the window Tohono, and 4 men from the group, on horseback, on the main street of Tucson, which had visibly noticed their presence, and was conducting itself with the particular loudness of a place that is pretending it is not staring. And Harlan went outside. Tohono looked at him from horseback. "You didn't need to come," Harlan said. "No," Tohono agreed. A pause. "But you came, yes." Harlan looked at the 4 men behind him, who had ridden 3 days to stand on a street in a city that had not historically been welcoming to them, for reasons that were entirely the city's fault and none of theirs. "Is Chima?" "She stayed with the land," Tohono said. "Someone had to, right? Someone had to. The person who should logically have come couldn't, because the thing they were fighting for needed a person standing on it." "Prentice needs witnesses," Harlan said. "We know," Tohono said. "He'll need statements about presence on the land, continued use. It'll be in English." In a room with a government official, Tohono met his eyes, the look of a man who has done the math already and is not here to renegotiate the sum. "We know," he said again. The hearing was on the 8th day. Prentice had worked without visible pause for the preceding 72 hours. Harlan had watched him with a kind of awed respect, the focused ferocity of a small man with a large desk who has found something worth being furious about, and channeled that fury into the most precise, methodical, devastatingly documented legal argument the territory of Arizona had possibly ever seen filed on behalf of 400 acres and a creek, the original survey, Harlan's deed. 3 years of documented improvements, the well log, the fence records, the livestock registry, all of which Harlan had kept because he was his father's son, and his father had been a Virginia man who believed records mattered. And the witness statements, Tohono's, 2 of the other men, given in English, precise and direct and without embellishment, describing use of the land, access to the water, presence on the territory that predated Harlan's ownership by generations, which was, and Prentice had explained this with the satisfaction of a man who has found the right argument, legally significant. The territorial system Graf was using to redraw maps was built on the concept of prior use. And if anyone had prior use of that plateau, it was not Burton Graf or Territorial Mining Company. The land office official was a man named Alcott. He was not corrupt, exactly. He was the more complicated thing. A man who had made a series of small accommodations to power over the years, and had arrived at a place where accommodation had become habit, and habit had become a kind of unconscious bias toward the interests of people with good coats and filed paperwork. He looked at Prentice's documentation. He looked at Harlan. He looked at Tohono. His face did several things. Then it settled into the expression of a man who has realized that the correct decision and the convenient decision are not the same thing today, and who has, to his credit, barely, but genuinely, decided to make the correct one. The amendment filed by Territorial Mining Company, he said, is denied on the basis of inconsistency with the original survey language and lack of documented basis for the claimed error. He stamped the paper, set down the stamp, and that was that, except it wasn't. Because Alcott looked at his desk for a moment, then looked up at Harlan and said something that wasn't in any legal document and wasn't required, the Northern Plateau situation is going to come up again. You understand that? I do. There's no formal protection for it in current territorial law. I know. Someone will file again. Maybe not territorial, but someone. Harlan looked at him. I know, he said. We'll be there when they do. Alcott held the look for a moment, nodded once. Not warmth, exactly, but acknowledgement, which was enough. They rode back in a group, Harlan and Tohono side by side for long stretches. Not always talking, more often not, but with the companionable ease of people who have done something difficult together and come out the other side and don't need to discuss it at volume. The second day, somewhere in the red stretch between the low desert and the high plateau, Tohono said, "My sister." Harlan kept his eyes on the trail. Yes, she doesn't do things without thinking, I know. She thought about this. I know. For a long time I figured. Tohono looked at him sidelong. Don't make her regret it, not a threat. A statement of fact delivered in the specific tone used by older brothers since the beginning of human time, across every culture and language, the tone that says, I am telling you this once, plainly. After this we don't need to speak of it again. I won't, Harlan said. Tohono nodded. Faced front, they rode. He saw the smoke from 2 miles out. Not wrong smoke, right smoke. The particular column of a large fire, burning clean, rising straight in the still evening air, orange and amber against the darkening sky. Coming from the center of the property, he rode faster, not from fear, from something else. Something that pulled like a current. He came over the last rise and stopped his horse. The yard of the property was full of people and firelight, and the particular organized liveliness of a community that has gathered around a fire, not from accident, but from intention. Children he recognized, the ones who had discovered the apple trees, running the periphery. Women he knew from months of exchange across the flat stone. Men who had reset his fence posts and reinforced his barn beams. Chima, standing at the edge of the fire, talking to Itza. And then she turned, did not run toward him, did not make a large gesture of it, held his gaze across the yard. And something in her face did the thing it did when she was trying to keep it composed, and not entirely succeeding. He dismounted, handed the reins to one of the younger men, who took them with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had been expecting his return. Which apparently everyone had. He went to her. They stood at the edge of the fire, close enough to feel the heat on one side and the cool of the September night on the other. The hearing, she said. We won. A breath. Not relief, exactly. Something deeper than relief. The exhale of someone who had been carrying a weight and had just felt it redistribute. Prentice is good, Harlan said. And Tohono? He walked into that land office and gave his statement and did not flinch once. Something moved in her face. Pride, The kind that has sadness wound through it. The pride of a woman who knows what it cost her brother to stand in that room and knows he did it without complaint and will not speak of it after. "I know he didn't," she said quietly. They stood for a moment. The fire crackled between silences. Alcott said, "It'll come up again," Harlan said. "Someone else will file. Yes, we'll have to fight it again. Yes, I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him directly. That look, the one that had undone him the first time, and had been undoing him in small increments ever since, and that he had stopped trying to be unmoved by somewhere around April, and just accept as a permanent feature of his landscape. "I know," she said, "the agreement, with Tohono. I want to do it right. Both languages. Written down, he knows, I want it to mean something, not just in my system. In yours," she was quiet a moment. "In ours," she said, the word landed oars. Not dramatic, not a proclamation. Just a quiet, deliberate shift of a single letter that changed the meaning of everything around it. He felt the weight in his chest. Moving. Not gone, he had stopped. Expecting gone, but it had found a different place to sit. Lower. Quieter. More like ballast than burden. The difference between weight that pulls you down and weight that keeps you steady. Itza came to them, as she always did, without announcement. Without asking if the moment was convenient. She said something to Chima. Chima listened, looked at the fire. Then at him, she says, "The earth has been holding the weight you brought here." He waited. She says it's done holding it. A pause. She says it's time to plant something in its place. He was quiet. He thought about 4 apple trees wrapped in wet cloth, carried 260 miles. He thought about the second chair, the second hook. The garden with too much space for one person. All the things he'd built in the shape of an expectation he hadn't admitted to himself. "Tell her," he said, "that I've already started." Chima translated. Itza looked at him. Her face did something that was. In a woman who deployed expression, with the deliberate economy of someone who has very little patience for the unnecessary. As close to warm as she apparently ever got, she nodded. Once. Turned. Walked back to the fire, which was, from Itza, approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. Tohono came to him later. When the fire had settled to its lower, steadier burn, they were quiet for a while. "We should write the agreement," Tohono said. "Yes. Both languages? Yes. My English is better than it was. It's better than good." Tohono took that in without false modesty. "We'll need someone to read the territorial legal language," he said. "Prentice, the small man, he's thorough." "Yes." Tohono almost smiled. I noticed. They were quiet again. "This won't make everything simple." Tohono said, "No. People in the territory will have opinions. People in the territory have opinions about everything," Harlan said. "I'm in practice." Tohono looked at him. "Harlan, yes. I came to this plateau to stop running. A pause, that's what I came for. Not the land, not the silence. Just to stop." He looked at the fire. "Turns out you can't actually stop by yourself. You can only pause. Real stopping requires something worth stopping for." Tohono was quiet a moment, then, "You are family, not a large declaration, not ceremony. Just a fact stated plainly. By a man who did not state things he didn't mean." Harlan felt it land, felt it settle, somewhere in his chest. In the space the weight had occupied for 11 years. "Yes," Harlan said. Tohono faced the fire. The subject was closed, which was how Tohono closed subjects that mattered. Completely, without drama, because the finality was the point. The agreement was written the following week. Prentice rode out from Tucson, which he complained about at length and then did without actually complaining about it, because that was his way. He sat at Harlan's kitchen table, with both chairs occupied and 2 additional chairs borrowed from wherever Chima produced chairs when chairs were needed, which Harlan had learned not to question. Shared use, water access, reciprocal maintenance, the Northern Plateau specifically named. Not as protected land in the territorial legal sense, because the territorial legal sense didn't have a category for what it needed to be, but as acknowledged land. Land with recorded history. Land with documented continuous presence. Land with a name now, 2 names. The English one and the Chiricahua one. Both written down, both on the record. Prentice read the final language aloud. Harlan signed. Tohono signed. The pen looked foreign in his hand for a moment. Unfamiliar, the way any tool feels the first time before the hand learns it. He signed with the steadiness of a man who has made his decision and is now simply executing it. Prentice notarized it, put his stamp on it, looked at both of them. "This is not standard," he said. "No," Harlan agreed. "There's no precedent for the land acknowledgement language in territorial filing, I know. Which means it'll be tested." "We know," Tohono said. Prentice looked at the document, at both of them. Something moved behind his professional expression, something he kept brief and managed quickly. But it was there. "Good," he said, which was from Prentice, its own kind of approval. The fire that night was larger, not planned, not announced. It simply grew, the way things grow in that country, when the conditions are right, and nobody is stopping them. Someone brought wood, someone brought food. The word moved through the camp the way words move when there's something worth saying. Pepe came. Harlan stood at the edge of the yard, the fire at the center of his property. The people around it, some he knew well, some he barely knew, some he recognized only by silhouette. The sound of 2 languages mixing in the air. English and Chiricahua, phrases traded back and forth, laughter at the collisions. The particular music of people trying to meet each other in the middle of a language gap, and finding that the middle is closer than expected. He stayed at the edge, not because he felt excluded, because there are moments you need to observe whole before you enter them. Some things are worth standing back from long enough to understand what you're looking at. What he was looking at was a life. Not the life he'd planned. Not the life he'd had and lost. Something entirely different from either of those. Something he hadn't known he was building. Tohono appeared at his side. "You're not going in," Tohono said. "In a minute, you're doing the thing where you look at something before you allow yourself to have it." Harlan glanced at him. "Is that a thing?" "It's your thing," Tohono said. "I've been watching you do it for a year. Fair, probably accurate. Go in, tone out an order. An invitation, the kind that knows it's been earned and doesn't need to perform at itself." Harlan went in. Chima was sitting on a stone near the fire. Not the flat stone by the creek, that was their stone, which was a thing he'd decided without ceremony, and apparently she had too. A different stone, larger. Near the fire's warmth, he sat on the ground beside the stone, which put him slightly below her eye level. Which was, and he registered this without comment, the first time that had happened, because she was a person who arranged herself at a level with other people, or slightly withdrawn from them. And this was not that. This was her sitting above him. Him choosing to sit below, without planning it. The both of them noticing, neither saying anything about it. Itza was on the other side of the fire. She said something. Chima's face shifted. That specific shift he'd learned. What did she say? Chima looked at the fire for a moment. She said the land has a good memory. She said it remembers everything that happens on it. Every choice. Every person who decided to stay when leaving was easier. He looked at the fire. At the 4 apple trees just visible at the edge of the firelight. Taller now than when he'd planted them, carrying their fruit. Rooted in soil that had no reason to accommodate them and had done it anyway. 11 years, he said. She looked at him. That's how long I was running. Before I came here, I know. I thought coming here was stopping. It was the beginning of stopping, she said. He considered that. She wasn't wrong. There's a difference between going still and actually stopping. Between the absence of motion and the presence of rest. He'd gone still in Arizona. The actual stopping. The putting down, the turning to face, the choosing that had started later. On a morning in October when a woman knelt at a creek and looked at him without flinching. Chima, yes, that first morning. At the creek. You'd already decided something about me. Before I brought the cornbread, yes. What did you decide? She was quiet a moment. The fire moved between them. I decided, she said carefully, that you were worth the risk of being wrong about. He sat with that. And something about that particular formulation. The honesty of it. The absence of romance or inflation. The plain acknowledgement that it had been a risk and she'd chosen it anyway. Landed in him more squarely than anything soft could have. Worth the risk of being wrong about. That was what it was, wasn't it? Love, or the beginning of it, not certainty. Not the fairy tale version with guaranteed outcomes, the actual kind. The kind that knows it could go wrong and chooses forward anyway. You weren't wrong, he said. She looked at him. No, she said. I wasn't. Later. After the fire had burned lower, after most of the group had moved to their sleeping places, Harlan went inside, stood in the kitchen, looked at the table. 2 chairs. He pulled both of them up and sat in one. Left the other pulled up, ready, not waiting, just ready. He heard her step on the porch. The door. A pause. You left the lamp on, she said. Yes, she came into the kitchen. Looked at the table, at both chairs, sat down in the second one. Not a large moment. Not a ceremony, just a woman sitting in a chair that had been empty for 11 years. Sitting in it like it had always been hers. Which, and this was the thing that undid him, quietly, completely. In the specific way the truest things undo you. It had been. He just hadn't known whose it was waiting for. He looked at the second hook by the door. Her woven bag hanging on it. Red and blue and deep yellow ochre. The same colors as the small object she'd left on the flat stone that first week. The thing he'd carried in his vest pocket for 6 weeks. The thing that was now in a box by the bed, kept with the same care he kept the letter Elsa had written him from her sister's house the winter before she died. Things that marked the before and after of a life. He had 2 befores now, and this was the after. They talked, quietly, about Prentice. About the next fight that would come. About whether it would be the same people or different ones. The same arguments dressed up new. Are you afraid of it? She asked. He thought about it honestly. No, he said. Afraid is the wrong word. I spent a long time being afraid without calling it that. Calling it preference. Calling it choice. Calling it peace. She listened. It wasn't peace, he said. It was distance. They feel similar from the inside. She was quiet. What changed? She asked. A woman looked at me across 70 yards and didn't flinch, the corner of her mouth. Both corners. And this time it didn't retreat. This time it stayed. Fully, warmly. Completely. The laugh she was trying not to let happen arriving anyway. Soft and real and the most purely happy sound he had heard in a room in a very long time. He felt it in his chest, not the weight. Not where the weight had been. Something new growing in the space the stone had occupied. Something with roots. The next morning he was at the creek before sunrise. Old habit. She came down from the rock shelf without being asked. They stood together at the water and didn't speak. Which was enough. Which had always been enough once he'd learned to stop filling the silence with the wrong things. He wrote a letter to his brother Emmett in Virginia that afternoon, who he hadn't written in 2 years, not from anger. From the particular exhaustion of trying to explain a life to someone who hadn't lived it. He wrote that he was well, that the land was good, that the apple trees. Emmett would remember the hint. Apple trees had helped him wrap the roots that last morning in Virginia were thriving. More than thriving. He wrote that he was not alone anymore. He sealed the letter, set it by the door. 1 month later, the agreement officially filed with the Territorial Land Office. 3 copies, Harlan's, Tohono's, in Chiricahua, in Shima's handwriting, which was precise and clear. Prentice's the apple harvest done. 16 bushels. More than he'd ever had, because this year there had been more hands, the cellar stocked for winter. The north fence solid. The east garden replanted with what Shima had taught him. Deep-rooted, drought-adapted, plants that knew how to be thirsty and produce anyway. A morning in October. 1 year, almost to the day, since Chima had knelt by the creek in the early light and looked at him across 70 yards without flinching. He was standing in the yard, coffee cup in hand, looking at the property the way you look at something you've built. Not with pride, exactly, but with the quieter thing. Satisfaction. The knowledge that this exists because of choices made one at a time. None of them certain, all of them forward. Chima came out of the house, stood beside him, looked at the same property. "What are you thinking?" she said. He was quiet a moment. "My father used to say that the best thing a man can do with a piece of land is leave it better than he found it." Good advice. He meant the soil, Harlan said. The structures, the trees. She looked at him. "I think he meant more than that." "Yes," Harlan said. "I think he did too." The morning moved around them, the creek talking, the hawk out over the canyon, the apple trees putting out their last leaves before the cold came. That slow, reluctant letting go that trees do better than people mostly. But people learn, sometimes, if they stay in one place long enough. If they let the weight settle, if they plant things in the wrong soil, and water them anyway, and wait to see what grows. "It's coming today," Chima said. "I know, she'll have opinions. She always has opinions. They'll be correct. They always are." Chima almost laughed, almost. Then did, quietly, really, the kind of laugh that doesn't need an audience because it isn't performing anything, just expressing something true. He turned and looked at her. She turned and looked at him, and there it was, right there in the October morning, on 400 acres of red Arizona earth, in the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable moment of two people who have chosen each other through the long work of being honest and the longer work of being present. No ceremony, no announcement, just there, the same way the apple trees were there, the same way the creek was there, because they'd stayed, because they'd held on, because roots don't ask permission. They just go deeper. Years later, when Harlan's hair had gone silver, and Chima's had followed, and the apple trees had multiplied to 16. And the grandchildren of the children who'd first discovered them were the ones climbing branches now. Someone asked Harlan what he'd learned. From all of it, from the plateau and the silence, and the woman at the creek and the years, and the fights, and the agreements, and the mornings. He thought about it. For a long time, that, stopping, he said, is not the same as arriving, a pause, and that arriving isn't something you do once. He looked at the land, red and permanent, patient as the water beneath it. You arrive every day, he said. Every morning you get up and you choose the same things again. The land, the people, the work. He was quiet a moment. That's what love is, I think. Not the moment you decide. The 10,000 mornings after. The creek talked to itself below. The hawk turned one long circle over the canyon. The apple trees stood in their improbable, stubborn, thriving row along the south wall. And Harlan Red, who had once ridden to a plateau to stop running and discovered it was only the beginning, went inside where the second chair was waiting, as it always was, as it always would be.